two peoples and our history have been interlinked for more than 1,000 years. But because of historical forces beyond our control, we were temporarily set apart. And it was only in 1966, at the beginning of the Marcos presidency, that the lines of communication were reopened between the Philippines and China.
Capital of the People's Republic of China, probably has always been one of the most intriguing and dimly understood power centers of the world. Having seen dynasties rise and fall, so many foreign powers come and go, Peking has shown the world a cautious face. And perhaps the caution was understandable. There is a sense in which silence inaugurated the biggest social experiment our century has known so far. "25 years ago, on October 1st, Mao Zedong proclaimed the birth of the People's Republic of China from Peking's Gate of Heavenly Peace. Today, he said, the people of China stood up. But history is perhaps never more obscure and more elusive than when it is being made. And for more than 2 decades, the world turned its back on the reality represented by Mao's declaration. The reality of 800 million human beings involved in the creation of a radically new culture. Mao's China has since taken its rightful place in the United Nations and is as much a Mecca now for statesmen and politicians as Washington and Moscow. But the People's Republic extends its welcomes selectively, often not purely in recognition of official ties, but as a result as well of the premium it places on the individual guest. Thus it was perhaps with the First Lady of the Philippines, Imelda Marcos. When she arrived on the 20th of September for a goodwill visit, the special representative of a neighbor who still has to extend this formal recognition to its host. Waiving their normal procedure, the Chinese allowed Philippine Airlines to fly the First Lady and her party direct from Manila to Peking. The privilege was but the foretaste of many extraordinary honors and courtesies which the Chinese were to extend to their Asian guests. Almost as though the occasion were not a first meeting, but a reunion. Mrs. Marcos, her son Ferdinand Jr., and the rest of her party, including Secretary of Industry Vicente Paterno, arrived to a welcome worthy of a head of state. Leading the welcome was Vice Premier Li Shen-yen, one of 2 men who had been running the Chinese government since June, when Premier Zhou Enlai entered the hospital for major treatment. Important ministries and state agencies were well represented, along with members of the diplomatic community. And 2,000 children greeted the guests with an exuberance of color and sound. By any standards, the welcome was overwhelming. It set the tone for the crescendo of attention that followed. For within 3 hours of her arrival, Mrs. Marcos was face to face with Premier Zhou, to whom she owed the invitation. She was the first visitor to see him in more than 2 months, and that by itself was news. Touched by the First Lady's gift of fresh orchids from the Philippines and in high spirits, the old gallant told her, Mrs. Marcus, your visit has made me well. Disproving unfounded speculation that Joe's 2-month absence from public view boded his retreat from the front ranks of power, the meeting made headlines in Asia the next day and big news around the world. For more than an hour, the Premier and the First Lady discussed the substantive issues of developing relations between the Philippines and China and laid the groundwork for subsequent discussions during the visit. Joe deputized Vice Premier Lee to pursue the talks with Mrs. Marcus and Secretary Paterno. This early, Premier Joe had indeed sealed the success of the visit. In the next hour, another Chinese leader went out of the way to welcome Mrs. Marcus personally. That night, at the Great Hall of the People, Vice Premier Lee hosted a banquet for Mrs. Marcus in the name of Premier Joe. Recent friendly and trade exchanges between the Philippines and China, Lee noted, were proof that countries with different social systems can develop their relations in peaceful coexistence. And Mrs. Marcus replied that the time has come to see what steps the two countries can take to forward relations more deliberately. On her last night in Peking 3 days later, Mrs. Marcus gave a return banquet in the same hall. And then, with Vice Premier Lee, witnessed an exchange of notes between Secretary Paterno and the Chinese Minister for External Trade on the terms of a preliminary trade agreement between China and the Philippines. China would sell the Philippines a continuous supply of oil and buy increased quantities of the major Philippine exports. It was the first concrete result, and a very substantial one, of this goodwill visit by the First Lady. At the Double Bridge Commune outside Peking, she observed at first hand the integrated organization which the Chinese have evolved as their basic social, political, and economic unit. In a land where 4 out of every 5 persons till the soil, self-sufficiency through hard work and self-reliance has been the goal, whether it be running their own affairs, providing the basic services in health and education, or production on the farm and suitable rural industries. Health services, for example, combine professional care with the work of barefoot doctors, Western medicine with traditional methods. In every way, old methods and new ones are continually synthesized. A good harvest will owe as much to patient cultivation with hoe and plow as to the new high-yielding varieties, to night soil for fertilizer, as to modern ways of irrigation and water management. If not the land of milk and honey, China today has progressed dramatically from the widespread hunger and poverty among its masses before 1949 to enviable status as the only developing nation able to feed itself today besides storing food for emergencies. The Chinese people are not allowed to forget at what cost they have achieved their self-sufficient, egalitarian society. They live within sight and touch of their long imperial past in well-preserved reminders that have become public parks. Inside Peking's Forbidden City, the visitor is made aware of the isolated grandeur in which the emperors lived on the toil of millions who never rose from the oppression of poverty during the centuries of feudalism. 200 years before Christ, a prince of the Eastern Han was buried in a jade suit sewn with gold, and so was his wife. Such priceless archaeological finds and countless others on display around China also serve to identify the Chinese of today with the splendid culture created by their forebears in the world's oldest continuing civilization, and provide rich evidence of old China's intercourse with the rest of the world. At the Great Wall in Pataling, Mrs. Marcos saw one of the world's engineering wonders, the only human structure, according to the astronauts, that is visible from the moon. In the 3rd century before Christ, China's vaunted first emperor put 300,000 men at work to build this 4,000-mile fortification against the barbarians of the north. The Chinese like to point out today that the emperor eventually lost his throne, not at the hands of the invaders, but in a revolt of the masses who disputed his sense of national priorities. Like many historical marvels, the wall today remains as much a monument to mankind's remarkable abilities as to its follies. 18 centuries separate the Great Wall of the Qins from the imperial tombs of the Mings. The 40-hectare grounds of the royal necropolis used to be off-limits to anyone living, apart from those in charge of its upkeep. It is now a favorite picnic site for the masses. Generously applauded by the Sunday crowds, Mrs. Marcos was led to the subterranean vaults where the Emperor Wan Li and his empresses were buried. The only one excavated of the 13 Ming tombs, it was a veritable underground palace. Forced labor, equivalent to 30,000 workdays daily for 6 years, and national treasure worth twice China's annual income in those years, went into the building of these memorials. Today, they serve to focus more sharply the socially productive labors of China's new society. The dead splendors of the past make a dramatic foil for the vitality of the present. At the instance of Madame Mao and the cultural group under the State Council, Mrs. Marcos was shown the best examples of the new cultural forms in which art is made to serve the national purpose. The revolutionary message is inescapable, but made vastly entertaining in such grand spectacles of total theater as the ballet Red Detachment of Women. In its blend of classical ballet, Western music, and certain stylized conventions of the Chinese theater, it demonstrates the party line of making the West serve the East, and the old serve the new. One need not accept the message to acknowledge excellence and creativity. No one clapped harder than the First Lady at the end of the 6-act ballet. She led the way on stage to greet the cast, members of the China Dance Drama Troupe, and presented them with flowers she had brought from the Philippines. The following night, the command performance for Mrs. Marcos moved from the Great Hall of the People to the modest theater of the Peking Workers' Club. Her host, the mayor of Peking, also serves as head of the cultural group under the State Council. Azalea Mountain, presented by the Peking Opera Troupe, was as impressive as the ballet, though it owed more to traditional Chinese opera than to the Western form. Before she left Peking, Mrs. Marcos was to be honored at her third command performance, a grand concert by China's leading artists, gathered together by Madame Mao to meet her distinguished guest, a patron of the arts and an artist herself. At every meeting with artists, Mrs. Marcos invited them to come to the Philippines and share your art with my countrymen. And at their request thereafter, she would sing for them, however often she felt, to show her appreciation. The Chinese also made provisions in the First Lady's schedule for attendance at Sunday Mass. Though formal religion is discouraged in China, religious freedom is allowed in theory. The Christian churches that operate are self-supported and administered, free of foreign ties. Mrs. Marcos heard Mass at Peking's Southern Church, Nantang. Before Mrs. Marcos left Peking, an attentive Madame Mao had half prevailed on her to extend her 8-day visit by 5 days as her personal guest. At Madame Mao's suggestion, the First Lady added the port city of Tientsin, China's third largest, to her itinerary. Accompanied by Vice Foreign Minister Han Yen-lung, who was her official escort for the rest of the visit, Mrs. Marcos arrived by train from Peking to an official welcome that didn't prepare her for the amazing proportions of the popular welcome that greeted her motorcade to the state guest house. At least 1 million of Tientsin's 6 million residents turned up along city streets to give Mrs. Marcos what she described later as one of the most memorable highlights of her life. Made famous centuries ago by Marco Polo, Paradise on Earth for the dynastic Chinese gave Mrs. Marcos pause on the 6th day of her China visit. She spent a quiet afternoon in her guest suite overlooking the tranquil beauty of West Lake after another tumultuous welcome beyond her best expectations. For Hangzhou, after all, is not unused to important guests. Here she reflected that if, as Madame Mao suggested, she stayed on till October 2nd, she would be in Peking again on October 1st, the silver jubilee of the People's Republic. It was an honor, but at the same time, she explained in a letter to Madame Mao from Hangzhou, she did not wish to overburden her hosts on their most important holiday. In the evening, the First Lady met the leading officials of Zhejiang, Premier Zhou's home province, and of Hangzhou, which is the provincial capital. It would be difficult to leave Hangzhou, she told them, but she had to fly on to Yan'an, the penultimate city on her itinerary. Yan'an is sacred ground in the annals of the Chinese Revolution, but it is seldom on the visiting list of VIPs. From the beginning, Mrs. Marcos had asked specially that Yan'an be on her schedule. I come like a pilgrim, she told the Yan'anese, to lay tribute at this shrine to human fortitude and strength. The little mountain town emptied itself into the streets to give this pilgrim its own moving tribute of welcome. 39 years ago, the ragged survivors of the Long March, a year's trek over 6,000 miles of China's most hostile terrain, arrived in Yan'an to make a new start, having fled the pursuing armies of Chiang Kai-shek. From 1935 to 1949, Mao Zedong and his comrades ruled their fledgling Chinese-Soviet government from here and pursued the revolution against the Japanese and against the Kuomintang to final victory. In those years, the Red Chinese leaders lived and worked in the simple, cave-like dwellings of northwest China. The houses occupied by Chairman Mao, whose undisputed leadership of the Chinese communists dates back to the Yan'an days, are the most visited shrines today. In this house, he wrote many of the speeches and articles that still sound the keynotes of the new China. In Yan'an, he and his comrades lived his admonition, serve the people. And today, no one coming to Yan'an can escape feeling awe that its arid, humble surroundings nurtured the revolution that transformed a quarter of mankind. Her visit to Yan'an, Mrs. Marcos said, would sharpen her perspective and insights when she began to interpret the new China to her people. It was fitting preparation for her dramatic, unscheduled meeting with Chairman Mao on the 27th of September. He had her fetched by special jet at Xi'an, where she stopped over after Yan'an to change planes for Shanghai. Now she and her son were at his villa in Wuhan, a city in central China where fall and winter are mild. In every speech since she arrived in China, Mrs. Marcos never failed to pay tribute to Chairman Mao as one of the greatest leaders in history. After this meeting, she recalls with affection and awe the humanity and love he radiated, his robust humor, his oriental gentleness. We are ready whenever you are for normal relations, the chairman assured her, and added in parting that he looked forward to meeting President Marcos one day. Arriving in Shanghai 4 hours behind schedule because of that historic detour to Wuhan, the First Lady was greeted with more than the usual fervor. News of the unexpected meeting with Chairman Mao had preceded her, and Shanghai's lavish welcome outdid itself. A fitting introduction to a city that is now the world's most populous and the last stop on this visit. Shanghai retains the famous waterfront skyline built up in decades of domination by the Western powers, who made it the Sin City of the Orient. Still the chief harbor for China's world trade, Shanghai funnels off the products of industry and agriculture from its rich hinterland, the Yangtze Valley. The sophistication that marked cosmopolitan pre-war Shanghai lingers today among its people, noticeably freer and more relaxed in manner and dress than elsewhere in China. Yet the city gave birth in 1921 to the Communist Party of China, and in the Cultural Revolution of the mid-1960s, it stood by Chairman Mao steadfastly. For the visitor with only a day or two to spend in Shanghai, the best introduction to the range, level, and quality of China's industry and technology is the permanent industrial exhibition housed in the former palace of Sino-Soviet friendship. Here, as at every place she visited in Shanghai, children welcomed Mrs. Marcos with their happy faces and chants. The First Lady was suitably impressed by the great variety of exhibits, which ranged from the most exquisite handicraft to automated monsters of industry. A section on vehicles displayed everything from giant payloaders to a custom-built limousine for VIPs, all very interesting and instructive. But goods and machines, unlike people, don't react. And for Mrs. Marcos, the joy of this visit was, above all, an interaction with all those she met, that instantly passed beyond any language barrier to a community of spirit. She roused the sense of kinship wherever she went, and she gave back in full measure. At this industrial workers' housing estate in Shanghai, it was as if everyone took a holiday to greet her on the day she visited. She felt equally at home with the old pensioners of the village, who have much to thank their new society for. As with the nursery children, she almost couldn't bear to leave. She spent time with the women who use their idle hours to augment family income in the estate's own workshops, where they assemble factory products from precision machines to toys. Later, at the Shanghai Children's Palace, she would watch, fascinated for hours, the wide range of artistic, scientific, and industrial training that the state provides for free to talented children under the age of 16. The activities amplify, at the same time, the children's indoctrination in the tenets of China's new society. But life in China today is, after all, a never-ending indoctrination in that society. It seems to work for them, though China's experience only proves that no system is absolute, that every system works best according to the way it is adapted to the needs and circumstances of the society it defines. In the new China that Mrs. Marcos saw, the theme was hard, unremitting work, within a system which nevertheless leaves children to dance and acrobats to prance when the occasion demands. But in this society, diligence and excellence are prized in work, study, or art, not for individual glory or ambition, but for their value to the common good. In the routine tasks of day-to-day, as in the highly skilled numbers of an acrobatic troupe, it is teamwork that counts, and there are no superstars. And the delicate balancing act of national survival in the modern age is lightened by moments of grace and felicity. China, Mrs. Marcos sought to dispel once and for all the clouds and mists of the Cold War that had obscured for more than 2 decades the centuries-old kinship between China and the Philippines. A quarter of a century is just about the length of time it takes a new generation to learn and adopt the habits of the culture into which it is born. In the case of China, which has had to adopt an altogether different social and political system, the gap in time made for an exuberance akin to that which is felt in the presence of something new. In the case of the Philippines, the newer society between the two, the 10-day encounter was perhaps occasion for a more poignant emotion and a reflectiveness that seeks to cope as much with the past as with the future. Equally for both, however, the First Lady's goodwill visit functioned as a kind of axis in time, henceforth the reference point for all the directions which the relationship between the two countries will take.